So we are about 5 after 12. So I want to welcome everyone to our March Lunch and Learn. We are focusing the next couple lunch and learns on getting fit and embracing healthy habits. And I am going to let Dustin introduce today's speaker.
Well, thank you all for being here. We're not 5 minutes past. For some reason, our computers are a little bit fast. So we're actually 12 o'clock on the dot. So hopefully we have more
Really?
people hopping
Yeah,
on.
it is.
Anyways, today's session is Get Fit, Nutrition with Altogether Wellness. And we have Dr. Jennifer, let's see, Quartano. Is that
You
good?
got it. Yeah.
Quartano. All right. And she aims to provide young patients and their families the tools they need to thrive without the restrictions of antiquated healthcare system. Dual board certified physical therapist in pediatrics and neurology, Dr. Jenny has a passion for seeing children and families successfully grow and flourish. After seeing the failures of the traditional medical model, she began her own practice in 2014, allowing a focus on the child and family together to maximize relationships and health quality. So, Dr. Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will just turn it over to you.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I want to make sure, can you see my screen, the presentation?
Yes, we can,
Okay.
and I will moderate questions. We can save it for the end throughout the presentation.
Right?
I'll keep up with the chat, and I'll make sure we answer as many questions as we can within our time frame. But yeah, we
Excellent.
appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I'm going to put my screen to the side. So thank you for managing that for me. And I'm going to go ahead and talk, but I am super flexible. So if you have questions come up that you think are relevant in the moment, let's go ahead and answer those. Let's have a conversation. And by the end, we'll make sure that you guys are all leaving with information that's valuable for you and for your loved ones. So thank you guys so much. As Dustin mentioned, I am a PT by background. So I love everything that has to do with nourishing our bodies, supporting our bodies, and just supporting our lives and livelihood. And so as a PT, what I really found, I worked from, like I said, NICU through the outpatient setting, early intervention, and the schools. That holistically, what we do is so much more than exercise and movement in terms of PT, right? And really, that nutrition matters, and having the right ingredients, the right foundations for repairing tissue, for growing, for creating healthy lives is so important. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've really been focused on that side of it. And so our practice now serves families who are, looking for that comprehensive approach. Maybe we'll talk a little more about what that might look like at the end if you're thinking, okay, this sounds good, but how do I help my family member? So that said, we're going to create a little bit of conversation around the current recommendations for foundations of health and longevity. And then we also are going to dive into some of the challenges that you guys probably face. That all sounds good and that's real and practical, but what happens when that doesn't make sense for me and for my loved ones? So we'll do a little bit about that. Okay. All right. So just diving in first, foundations of nutrition, really, really on a basic level. I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in there's the keto diet and there's the vegan diet and there's, paleo. And what do I do? What's the best way for me to eat, for my family to eat, for my child to eat? And so I think we really just have to take it back to the basics, right? Every single one of us needs all three of these nutrients, regardless, in some variety. Now, there's different reasons for different diets in different locations, whether that's a keto diet to help with somebody who might be struggling through a seizure disorder, for example. I've seen great success with that. Paleo diet to eliminate inflammation. But at the end of the day, all of these what we call macronutrients are vital to our child's success. So let's break that down a little bit. Protein, the building blocks for muscle and for tissue development. So protein is important for all of us, obviously, but might be higher needs in somebody who has higher low muscle tone, for example, right? We need to have enough muscle. And in those cases, we need to be even more intentional about supporting muscles and supportive connective tissues than we might have to be for somebody else. Post-surgery is another time it's really important to focus on protein and getting enough protein in our diet because that's going to promote recovery. Healthy fats are super important for brain function. So when I look at that, I think about those first few years of life. But beyond that, they're so important throughout life. And so I think, again, whether we're talking about a child moving into
Mhm.
adolescence and having this body image situation, right? Healthy fats are so important for cognitive function and overall health. So that's another place. Those don't have to be complicated, right? I think, we think about that and like, oh my goodness, what do we have? Things like avocados, nuts, and seeds are all really, really good versions of healthy fat. And then we have carbohydrates. Those are our energy, our fuel for our body, right? So for our active kids, I have a 5-year-old. He was on snack number 3 this morning by 11 o'clock. Like those are things that we need to create that energy to keep moving. And then I think important things for us to think about, again, for across the lifespan, is pairing that with fat or protein, right? So not just having the apple, but having it with peanut butter or some beef jerky or something along those lines is going to help regulate that blood sugar, because carbohydrates, being that energy source, can cause it to go way, way up and then crash. And we get hangry kids, or maybe some more blood sugar related issues. So stabilizing that is super important, and probably important for a lot of our kids more than even the typical population. And then lastly, vitamins and nutrients and minerals are so important. We call micronutrients, right? And so a lot of times this is where people think, well, I need a multivitamin, or I need to be taking zinc or this or that. And the reality is our food supply, right? If we eat whole foods, has plenty of those things for most people. So it's not necessarily relevant and really should be tailored to the individual. There are individuals with certain conditions or certain developmental issues or even certain nutrient deficiencies that really need those things, but it's not a one size fits all approach. And I don't think anybody should be sold on needing to take certain things all the time unless we have a knowledge and a background about why that's important. Any questions on that so far?
So far, we don't have any, no, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So good. So then when we think about, that's great, okay, we need all those buckets, but how does that work across the lifespan? And I'm going to give you this disclaimer. I am not a dietitian, not a nutritionist. I've just been studying this and how it impacts function and day to day for the last 5 to 6 years. So this is old data just to kind of give you a picture of like how much do you really eat. And I don't want you to get so focused in the details here, but I want to grab a couple of things that I think are important. So first and foremost, before a year, we're talking about nutrition from breast milk or formula only, right? We don't worry about what kids are taking in, how much food they're getting orally until they pass 12 months. And so our focus should be on making sure they're getting their nutrients from either one of those sources, whichever one we're using. Fed is always best first, and then we can start to look at what's more important underneath that. Beyond that, nutrition, I think, again, people get really caught up in protein, but the reality is we need somewhere between 13 and 20 grams until we reach those preteen years. An egg is 6 grams of protein. So 2 eggs a day is enough for our little. When you think about that as a day, right? So that's a little bit here and there. So if they're grazers, that is okay. Chances are they're getting their nutrition in. It jumps way up when we hit those pre-puberty stages, though, for most of our kiddos, and then goes up even into adulthood. And I would say these numbers probably are even a little bit outdated. This was 2005 data, but just again, big picture, right? Our needs change over the lifespan, particularly when it comes to protein. When we look at carbs, they really don't, right? So littles use a lot more of that energy because they're constantly moving. And so having that ample nutrition at a young age and then tailoring that as they get older is important. So that, again, I think, those numbers might be a little outdated, but the important piece is we don't necessarily need more. As we get older, we've got more muscle. We need to support that muscle, not so much increase our carbohydrates. And then fats are important throughout. So it should be a percentage of what we're taking in because our brain constantly needs those. It's not just in those early years where the brain is developing, but beyond that, we have to have those healthy fats across the lifespan to be able to maintain our cognition and all of the other things as well. So this data came from that 2005 data, like I said, in general. I think this document here, and I put the link in here, is much more up to date, just in terms of like broader picture of what does that look like in terms of servings for our kids versus as an adult, how much exercise, how many of those micronutrients and things like that as well. So there's some more data if you want to dive in deeper, but I just kind of wanted to bring your attention. I think a lot of times families get worried about how much protein, they're not getting enough protein. And the reality is when they're little, they really don't need that much. When they get older, we probably need to think about how we serve those carbohydrates and, pull back on having too many of those. And we'll talk a little bit about how do we support that and creating those healthy lifestyles. Okay. Here. A little bit of lag. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So practically then, what does that really mean? Okay, we've got these numbers we're shooting for. I think the biggest thing I always try to encourage parents and individuals, right, is think about foods across the week, not across each meal. So not do I have enough grams of each of those things at each meal, but rather, my child ate a plate of strawberries and 2 bites of their egg for breakfast. That's okay. At lunch, maybe all they ate was the peanut butter. And again, that is an okay rhythm. You and I are like that, right? Sometimes you go in the fridge and you're like, I just want the apple or I just want the this. That is okay. So think about foods across that week in terms of at each meal, in terms of creating a healthy environment, because we want kids to feel welcome, invited to the table, encouraged to eat, and encouraged to eat what they feel safe with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think that makes it easier as a parent to not get so wrapped up in the stress of mealtime, because mealtime can become a stress and it really isn't, right? Especially in our culture, mealtime is supposed to be social. It's supposed to be an engaging time with family or friends. And so we want to try and keep that rhythm from a pretty young age. A couple of things that we can do that are super helpful for kids, even from a young age, would be things like limiting our processed foods and added sugars. These would be things like, your fast food, even like your packaged snacks, all of those are processed, right? And so we can work on having less processed things. But if it comes out of a package instead of out of the perimeter of the grocery store, chances are it's got added chemicals, added sugars, and just things that aren't necessary. But more importantly, we don't want to create those space for them, if you will, in children before we have to. They'll find them soon enough themselves, I promise. If we can create that focus on real food, we're going to have much more success in bringing up kids who enjoy real food and eat a variety of food. Now, that said, maybe you're not there and maybe there's reasons in your child's life that didn't happen. That's okay. It's never too late to start. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. The last thing I would say about this practical approach is increasing and encouraging that listening to your body, right? I think I grew up in a household where the Clean Plate Club was super important. And I really worked hard to change that because we want the child to listen to their own inner cues of, I'm not hungry anymore, or I don't want to eat this, and not necessarily to be super selective. You can set parameters around that. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But we want to encourage them to listen to their body, eating when they're hungry, eating what they feel like they need, because that intuitive eating is really important as well. Now, there are kids where you're thinking that's not going to work for my kid. Maybe there's a medical diagnosis or a history or something there that prevents you from doing that, and that's okay. We can still talk about listening to our body while we set boundaries for those kids as well.
I have a question, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So Sandy said, and hi Kaya, I saw that in the chat. What about autistic kids that have a weak interception and don't sense fullness or hunger?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's going to be a situation where we probably need to set some boundaries. It's a great question. Working, and we're going to talk at the end about that multidisciplinary approach, working with OT on that interceptive piece is a super important component. Working with somebody with a nutrition or a dietitian background that's going to understand what your child truly needs and how much is too much, right? And then giving freedom within that for your child to the degree that it's available, right? Maybe that means putting out all that's available for that child at that meal. This is what we're having, or letting them choose, we can have this or that, but we only get this much of it. So we're giving that autonomy where we can, but then providing boundaries on the limits of what we can have within that. So I think there's definitely that moderation, and certainly those kids aren't the only ones that are lacking that interoception and feeling of fullness. There's definitely some medical conditions that also have that. And so I think that's where it is important. And it's, as a parent, to put boundaries on that. But what that looks like, hopefully we can still provide them some autonomy and control as well.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Absolutely. And we can talk more if there's more questions on that. Okay, so I kind of want to dive into this next though, because I think that was kind of a nice transition to what happens in the gut and why is that important. And so this again is kind of where I've spent a few years really focusing is we have our gut microbiome, right? And our microbiome sends signals all over our body. So if you're not familiar, the microbiome are the little guys that live inside your gut. They outnumber the cells of our body like 10 to 1. It's a ridiculous amount of little cells that live inside of there, little bacteria that are breaking down our food. They're necessary, helping us get the micronutrients we need for absorption, for use in our body. And we have a symbiotic relationship, right? The problem is for a lot of kids, and we know this to be true of various neurologic disabilities or neurodevelopmental disabilities, that microbiome changes. Any child that was born premature, right? Any long course of antibiotics or other medications like that will alter that microbiome. And that microbiome then changes how we feel full, what we absorb out of our food, all of those other things that are just, symbiotic to we need to eat, but it's not as simple as the food goes in and it's just absorbed. There's lots of other factors, and the gut microbiome is a big part of that. There's a huge connection too between the gut and the brain. And so we know that that gut brain connection is where 90% of our neurotransmitters are made. So things like serotonin, happy things. So when we look at mental health disorders or attention deficit, they're really starting to show that there's a ton of research linking that to the microbiome. And so again, that doesn't mean we need to rush out and change everything, but being attentive to the foods and the things we eat that are going to influence that microbiome. And perhaps there's a time and a place for probiotic support and things like that as well. So probiotics would be basically giving influence to that microbiome. So taking in different bacteria that are going to enhance that. You could do that through, various strains. You see them all over the place, and there's a ton of them. The challenge is each one has a different meaning. So when you see it, it's not just the name. There's usually a number behind it, and that tells us about what it's going to do in the body. There's been research done on it. So those are super important to be targeted if we're going to be taking them. The good news is we naturally have a good microbiome in our bodies mostly, unless we've done something to disrupt it. We can eat foods that are probiotic rich, like yogurt, things that might be less popular with kiddos, but kefir, anything fermented, so sauerkraut, pickles, those kinds of things can add and enhance our probiotics as well, probiotic intake. And then there's prebiotics. Prebiotics are the fibers that feed those little guys. And so those are our fruits, our vegetables, some of our beans and things like that are going to have the fibers that are rich in there for those little guys to munch on and flourish. And I think of the microbiome like a garden, right? So if you've got nothing in your garden, maybe we've wiped out that whole microbiome by having to take antibiotics. There's an opportunity for weeds to grow, right? And those weeds can be really influential, not just on things like gut health, but also on digestion and absorption, and even on mental health, anxiety, depression, focus. All of those things have actually been linked back to that healthy gut microbiome. So if we have too many weeds, by not having enough of the good things, we can definitely change how our kids are focusing, how they're feeling day to day, their explosive attitudes and behaviors. And I'm not saying this is end all be all. It's just a component that I think we need to consider when we think about nutrition as an overall for our kids and their health. So, on the flip side, the good news is if we get the right nutrition in and the right pieces and the right microbiome makeup, we can see positive changes in that as well. And it can be really helpful for our kids to even have that awareness of satiety because that interoception improves from that improved connection. So that was a lot, I know. Tell me if you've got any questions on that.
I do have one more question in the chat from
Yeah.
Shayla, and she said, when and how often should probiotic supplements be taken?
Yeah. Okay, great question. So I think really the hard answer is it depends, right? If you've got a healthy child with a healthy gut microbiome who eats a really good diverse diet, then they probably don't need that supplementation on the regular. Times when I think it probably is really good in general is, after any sort of antibiotic or steroid course. Those two things tend to really knock down our microbiome. So having supplementation during and after that to restore it can be super helpful. With that, and kind of in general nuance, we wouldn't want to take it with the antibiotic. So let's say we're taking the antibiotic morning and night. We would want to put the probiotic in the middle so that we're not killing that off as well. and then again after to continue for a course. So that's probably a time where almost everybody could benefit from having microbiome support. Outside of that, it really kind of depends. It depends on what you're seeing in your child. Are they having gut related issues? Are they having emotional regulation issues? Do they have a limited diet? Those would be situations where I would say most likely they could benefit from having some sort of probiotic support. And then along with that, there, like I said, each of those is so specific. So for example, there are very specific types of gut microbiome support that we would want, for example, a child with eczema versus a child with attention deficit disorder. There's some very distinct research on which strains and things like that. So that's something we could certainly dive into, but it would be so child specific on that as well.
Okay, and then I see one more from Sandy. Are there any probiotic foods that don't have a high histamine and aren't dairy, egg, gluten, soy? My son has EOE,
Uh-huh.
eosinophilic esophagitis, and those
Yeah.
are trigger foods and currently has high histamine in blood.
Yeah. Okay, so that is definitely there's a lot there, right? I would say most often, most of our probiotic foods are going to be higher in histamine. And when we talk about EOE, it's really about getting to those triggers first, right? And bringing down that reaction. So a lot of times we start with things that are going to reduce the inflammation in the gut. There's a little bit different approach before we would add in a probiotic. I would say typically in that case, no. I've got several clients right now that are working through EOE, are either active or post that, and how we approach that really matters as we're going through it. But if you've got high histamines and you're having a lot of, what that tells me is probably results of things leaking out of the gut and into the body, creating that histamine and inflammatory reaction, I wouldn't probably start with probiotics. I would hold on that until we figured out how to get those triggers under control, the inflammation down in the gut, which is a little different approach before we would add that back in. So I would say probably not where I'd want to go first.
All right, those are the only two I saw in the chat at this moment.
Okay, awesome. Well, then we will keep going, and we can certainly talk more about those, at the end or as you think of other questions.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so bigger picture, whether we're talking about very specific things like EOE or a child who maybe was on a G tube for a period of time, or just a child who has very selective and picky eating. I think big picture is all about how do we build a healthy relationship with food? And I think it's so easy as a parent, especially a parent with a child with special needs, to miss the forest through the trees, right? We're getting stuck in this thing that's right in front of us because it's important, right? We've had to get past that emergency. EOE is no joke, right? Needing to be on feeding tube for supporting vitality is important. All of those things are things we need to do. But then longer term, it's about how do we build that relationship with food? Encouraging that exploration, encouraging curiosity, starting with very low pressure, right? Creating an opportunity for safe exploration of food and ability to say, no, thank you, I'm not ready for that. So avoiding that structure, avoiding that pressure, I guess maybe is a better word, because we probably do want to structure mealtime, but also not creating pressure to eat more, because oftentimes that backfires. When we talk about kids, oftentimes particularly kids with medical histories or developmental histories, there's so much that they don't have control over, right? We take them to this appointment, we force them to do these things because it's important, they have to take this medication. They're looking for something to control. And so as a generalization, food is something I can control. You can't make me put something in my mouth and eat it. And so I think creating that balance of what's important to us as a parent versus what's that autonomy we need to create in a child is a super important part of increasing variety, increasing intake. And we'll talk some strategies about how do we do that as well. And then I think the last thing is role modeling, right? So when I worked in early intervention, I can't tell you, how many times families would say, oh yeah, we eat dinner together. And really, that's great, right? That's such an important piece of social eating and modeling. And how do we do that as a society? But really, what that might look like when you're an exhausted parent at the end of the day is everybody's got their food on the coffee table and your child is kind of watching the TV and running around. And so that might be important for certain kids to not be restricted to a chair, at least initially. I'm not saying that's, must be, but I think it just creates a different environment of what are they seeing in terms of what you're eating and how are what are the behaviors that you do? Parents, we are so much, that role model for them, whether we know it or not. So if you're saying, oh, I can't eat that because it's going to make me heavy or those kinds of things, they hear that, right? Case in point, my 5-year-old came out of bed a few weeks ago and said, I'm hungry. I need a snack tonight. And I said, what do you think you need? Because we're done, right? We have boundaries around dinner. He's healthy. He, sometimes likes to get excited and active. And so I'll remind him dinner is now, right? Which is a very fine boundary to set for your kids who can handle that. Well, he said, I think I need a peanut butter and jelly. That has protein in it. It'll keep me full longer. And I had to laugh. And then he got peanut butter and jelly because I don't know where you pulled that one out of, but okay, he's listening, right? He's listening all the time when I'm telling people, make sure you pair this with this, or, educating my teens on important relationships with food. And so I think being that role model, understanding that even if you're not saying it out loud, they're noticing and they're paying attention. That's really important. Okay, so what are some practical strategies then? I think it's really important to introduce new foods in a positive way. And what that looks like is going to depend on, the age and ability of your child. So that might look like cutting it up into fun shapes, right? And I think I've had more than one parent say, I'm not going to be that parent. I definitely have a Mickey Mouse shaped cutter for different foods, right? So introducing it in a positive way. Also introducing it more than once. So I think the number is somewhere around 13 times. It takes the child to decide if they really like something or not. Doesn't mean they have to try it every single time, but you put it in front of them, they touch it, they interact with it, perhaps they're making some shapes out of it. That's okay. Those are all introductions to food that are low pressure and creating a positive interaction for your child. It could be things like for an older child, engaging them in the kitchen. What are some different ways to cook it? Does it taste salty? Is it crunchy? What does that feel like? So creating some positive talk around it, even if it's not their favorite, getting some introduction that way. Make your mealtime enjoyable and low stress, right? So I think in terms of doing that for each child, really depends, but putting something that's safe on the table, particularly if you have a picky eater, is always a good strategy. So if your child only likes blueberries, then make sure they've got blueberries available and maybe a few bites of something else. And I think that is important too, right? Just a couple of bites. If it's new or they're not sure about it, you don't want to put a whole serving on there. Maybe it's a bite or two. Maybe it's a touch it, try it. Oh, you don't want it? Okay, you can set it on this napkin or set it on this plate in the middle. Again, very low stress, but they're getting an introduction to it. Getting your kids involved, we talked about that a little bit already, but maybe if we have the opportunity, taking them to the store, letting them pick things out with you, letting them smell it, touch it there where it's safe, and then bringing it home and helping with the preparation as well. And then I think it's important that we balance nutrition and our nutritional goals with flexibility, right? So whether that is, like I said, maybe blueberries is a safe food and we're going to eat all the blueberries. For your child that only eats chicken nuggets, they ate one blueberry. That's a success, right? And so I think we have to be willing to say, this is my goal. This is what I want for my child. This is what, our nutritional needs are. And also, this is where we're starting. Or we've done really well all week, and today they really want this X food that they used to only eat, and being okay with that flexibility. Today we're going to do that. Now tomorrow we'll do this. Another thing that might look like is tonight we're going out for pizza. So for lunch, we're going to eat, this healthier option, right? And so I think as a family, making those decisions, making those things verbal to set boundaries, but also help your child understand is really important. Any questions?
There was a question from the early, from like 2 or 3 slides ago. Somebody asked,
Okay.
or Shayla asked, are there any specific lab tests to run to check the health of a microbiome? A
Yeah.
microbiome.
Yeah. So we'll take a break from talking about food. And we'll talk about poop for a minute, right? Because that's where we test it. So I think when you go the traditional GI route, oftentimes they'll look for things like blood, maybe your major things like C. diff or any sort of like norovirus and those kinds of things. When we get into the functional side of it, we're actually diving into what does the microbiome look like. And so those are stool tests where we look at what bacteria make that up, very specific strains. And are they good bacteria? Are they things that are okay there, but we don't want them in big numbers? And are they things that actually can cause more inflammation and more problems in the body? And then pairing that with what your child's presenting with, how does it matter, right? Like what might be creating the symptoms or challenges your child is having. So in the example of EOE, we take a look at what might be causing that leakiness out of the gut and into the body, whether that's a bacteria, a virus, a parasite, even potentially. All of those things are going to matter. And what is the overall then health of the gut? So do we have the right pH? Because that's going to influence how our food is digested and absorbed. Do we have the right things present in the small intestines? Because that gives us an indication of if the food is being broken down the way we want it to. And then what does the stool look like? So yes, I would say to answer your question, I talk a lot about the TMI. There's no such thing as TMI, right? So we talk about poop, we talk about how often, how much, all of those things. And kind of a side note there, our kids should be pooping every day at least. And so when they're not, that's another indication there's a problem and an opportunity for things to back up. And then we get things like the wrong bacteria growing in the wrong places because we have things that are meant to be out of our body sitting in there for too long. So yeah, a couple of tests that exist would be something called the CSAP, which is a comprehensive stool analysis and parasite test. You might hear somebody say a GI map. That would be another one. And then there's a couple of others that exist, and just kind of depends on what we're looking for, what we think are the problems that would lead us down there. The other cool thing about all of those tests is they can be done at home. And I think for a lot of our kids, that is huge, right? Because going to a lab, getting a needle is a no-go. But collecting their stool at home, while it might take a little bit of work, is not such a daunting task to them, isn't traumatizing, and a lot of them have had enough medical trauma already.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about these already, but I think, just wanted to highlight again that if you have a child who is a picky eater, has texture sensitivities, food allergies and intolerances, particularly ones that are affecting their nutrition and their ability to get adequate nutrition, if there are things within your family or your culture, things you eat or don't eat that seem to be influencing your child's ability to get enough nutrition, and any of those emotional connections to food or sensory awareness of food, I guess that's affecting mental health as well. Those are times when it's really important to seek out professional help, right? Like, you guys are amazing as parents, but we take on so much. And so just know that there's a whole host of professionals out there. Our team, being a great example of our OT, who handles a lot of feeding and texture issues. We have speech therapists on our team who really does a lot with swallow and eating as well. We have a dietitian we consult with to make sure that it's child appropriate, but also makes sense for your family, right? I've had kids come in with orders from physicians or dietitians, and they're lovely, right? They mean well, but when we work in this siloed approach, we just give recommendations. And then as a parent, you're like, what do I do with this? There's no way my kid's going to go from this to this just because you told me to. So how do we bring that all together? And then the crux of that connection is the functional medicine piece, like we talked about. What is the gut microbiome made of? Are we sending signals to the brain that are influencing how hungry or not hungry your child is in a good or bad way? And how do we start to break that down in a step-by-step process so that you can get your child eating the things that are going to set them up for health across their lifespan? So just a quick note when we talk about, feeding readiness and littles, right? We've got parents here from across the lifespan. But I think this is important because, again, just as a PT, this is so underappreciated that those growth and oral motor milestones line up. So if you've got a child who is delayed for whatever reason, maybe they had a prolonged NICU stay, maybe they've got a condition that leaves them with low muscle tone or high muscle tone, and they're lacking in some of those skills at that age, you might see feeding also be delayed because so many of those skills are going to be reliant on what comes before that. And so here you can see on the top, kind of what we look at in our gross motor skills. And then on the bottom, you see what happens in our kiddos in terms of their oral motor skills. And I think it's important to appreciate that until we have this independent sitting, because there's so much that happens from a postural control standpoint, it's almost impossible to start oral feeding. And that doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. If your child is interested, then talk with your therapist and we'll, work on those things together. But you'll see in our little case at the end that really those things go hand in hand. And so as a PT, I'm very much involved in what's happening with that child because it related to feeding, because they have to have those skills as a precursor to be able to successfully eat and enjoy food. So just a quick note on that. All right. So I think this comes up a lot. I see this in our practice. I hear this from parents a lot of times and different Facebook groups. I think supplements have a place, right? And we certainly use them in our practice, particularly when we're working with kids who have very limited diets, who have some significant gut dysfunction. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But, I think they have a place, but they should be personalized. So I see so many times where this is a generalized vitamin routine every kid should be on. There is no such thing. Every child is different, and there are micronutrients that are important for gut health. There are micronutrients that are important for immunity. There are micronutrients that are important for growth. And yes, all of that comes from digesting and absorbing the right things. So if we don't have the right building blocks there to begin with, then there might be a reason for supplementing. But if we don't have the right microbiome breakdown, gut health environment, doesn't matter how great your supplements are, your child is probably not going to get and absorb them. So I think supplements should be an additive after or as we're looking at these other things instead of a foundation. Likewise, nutrition options for tube feed and oral supplementation are probably what got me on the soapbox in the first place, if I'm being honest. I used to work in trauma rehabilitation, right? And we are asking patients who have inflammation in their bodies, inflammation in their brain, trauma to recover from, to use this nutrition, right, to recover. And again, fed is best. But then let's look at what's in those things. And so in our traditional tube feed options, they're usually made of corn syrup solids, inflammatory oils. They're all things that can create a worse environment. So while they might have the macronutrients we talked about, the protein, the fat, the carbs, they might be relatively easy to digest. They certainly aren't helping enhance that recovery to the level that I feel like is possible. And so like in recent years, we've seen really good things like Date Farms, Nourish, there's a few others out there, Nestle Complete. It's definitely becoming more recognized. But I would argue and advocate for you as a parent that if you're using formula or you're using tube feed, that you're really looking at what's in it, not just the macronutrients, but also what are those ingredients that make it up, and are they helping, or is there something that could be better? And again, not the dietitian. It's super important you get the right food in. Food in is better than no food in, but I think that's really important to look at as we're looking at how is what we're putting in our body helping to regulate. Any questions?
There aren't any more, no, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So we think long term, what are our goals? When we talk about eating and feeding, it's setting up habits for a sustainable, healthy life, right? We want to create those habits from early on so that our kids enjoy healthy foods, they enjoy the right amount of healthy foods, we're regulating their bodies and their blood sugars, whether that comes through what we're eating and how that's impacting their body, or our microbiome and how that's impacting their body. All of those things are going to be important to set them up for a healthy lifestyle. And we talked about this a little bit, but there's an inside out approach of what we're eating, what we're putting in, and how that influences us. And then there's that outside in approach of like, how do I feel? How do I start to recognize how my body feels when I eat, too much sugar or dyes or things that have been shown to influence us in a not so great way. So I think helping with that mindful component at a level our kids can understand is important. And then we want to make sure that we're addressing food and body image positively. I think, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, right? But some kids just don't have that ability to recognize I'm full and I shouldn't have any more of this. And so creating those opportunities to address how our bodies should feel, or what is a healthy amount, or what are those things we need right now, and using those things to help us create a healthy image of food instead of any sort of body shaming. And I know we're all very much aware of this in today's day and age. And there's no one size fits all approach. But I think what is important is, not using things like identifying the child's body habitus as a reason to eat or not eat something, right? The same approach is taken whether the child is too thin or a little bit on the heavier side in terms of how we present food, because we want that relationship to stay positive. And then it's our job as parents and experts to set boundaries around that are going to also meet the health goals of that child. All right. So with that, I think if you take nothing else away today, engage your child as they're able to make choices around food. So again, this could be presenting two healthy options and asking which one they want, right? We're going to fill our plate with some sort of protein, some sort of fruit or vegetable, and some sort of carb. What is it you want on your plate? And then giving them those choices so that they can have some engagement in that. Talking about foods, right? Is it crunchy? Is it sweet? Is it sour? Helping them identify what they liked about that, but also creating that awareness around the food. Giving them those safe options like we talked about too, so that they feel like I have some safety, I have some control. And then there are also these things that are here that I'm going to try and engage with. Creating simple meals, I think, is really important, particularly as we're talking about our kids becoming teenagers and young adults. So creating things that they can enjoy, that they can create or make themselves, and engaging them in that and helping them understand, like my son, that the peanut butter and jelly was better for him because it had protein and fat in it to keep him full longer. Helping our kids to understand at an age appropriate level as well what that balanced nutrition looks like and how it influences how they feel. And then I think lastly, personalized eating is a must. And when I'm presenting to a group like this, I hope if nothing else, I'm empowering you to ask more questions, to search out additional resources, because medical history, developmental history, and genetics all matter. And yet, those things should be tailored to the child instead of a one size fits all. We've had several clients come and approach me. There's some very specific genetic conditions that have some recommended supplements based on the genetics. And that's great, but it's still not personalized, right? It's still based on the genetics of what we know about that condition. And so I think we have to, and we owe it to our kids to create a personalized plan for them. The questions on any of these takeaways, and we'll dive into a case in a minute, but I think I saw a couple of questions and comments pop up while you're chatting.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to unmute or click the little emoji that raises your hand, or you can just type it in the chat. We have a little bit of time to take some questions. We definitely appreciate Jennifer giving us this insight, because we know that nutrition is it's huge when it comes to our population, and so these tips are very, very helpful. So we definitely appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. We'll give it a little bit and see if anybody. Let's see. I think we have we don't have any other questions. But as Dina said, and I said earlier, we will send out a link to our YouTube, which we have all of our recorded meetings. We will also, I also send out certificates of attendance by request, so you can just send that to my email, which is dustin@arcflorida.org. And we're going to send out, the agenda, some of the slides or whatever, in the email. Everything that you need from this meeting and from this presentation will be in the email later this afternoon. So thank you all for taking your lunch time to be with us. And please don't be shy if you have any questions before we wrap up today.
Got a couple more slides we can head through, but I wanted to make sure we had ample time to answer questions for folks who are here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So far, no questions in the chat besides everybody just thanking you for the presentation. So you can keep on. You can show those slides.
All right.
Thank
you. Yeah, of course. So, I just wanted to kind of put this all together for you, thinking about, you guys asked some great questions, but what does this look like, right? So this is not Jack, but Jack started with us. He was 9 months old and really came to us first for a significant delay in gross motor function. And what our PT on the team noticed was that he just looked malnourished. He had sunken in eyes. Oral intake wasn't great. He was still being fed by tube. And honestly, mom shared and disclosed that I think this is not the first time this happened, right? She left the hospital with kind of like, here you go. Good luck. I guess maybe I was supposed to follow up with GI, but they never called. And so I've just been doing my best, right? And so he's progressing, but there's still challenges, still restrictions, still things that he wasn't getting enough of. And so we really took a holistic approach to this case. Our PT alerted our feeding therapist who went in and did an evaluation. Our feeding therapist reached out to our dietitian and said, hey, we really could use some calorie input here. Mom's doing her best, but she has no idea how much he's getting or, where it's coming from and how do we make sure he's getting enough for that healthy brain development, for enough energy, for enough to be able to create those skills that we're looking for. And then what's going on with his gut, right? He was not tolerating oral intake very well. His body wasn't breaking down food. It was coming out whole on the other side. And he had a pretty medically complex history that had left him with a long stay in the NICU and probably significant impact to his gut health. And so we started from the beginning, right? Our gross motor team was looking at how do we build those upright sitting skills so that oral intake is better, because undoubtedly we aren't going to have good postural control for swallowing, for chewing until we've got that skill. At the same time, our OT started with food exposure. So we have low expectations at the beginning of any sort of oral intake. It's this, right? Like, how messy can we get? Most of the time, our kids with this kind of history don't want to touch anything. And as we talk about, older children with neurodevelopmental disabilities, we see those kids too. Maybe they have 3 preferred foods and they've survived this long on that. But as a parent, I think and it tugs at your heart when that's all they enjoy. Plus, it's impossible to go out to dinner when we can't all eat together. So, exposure therapy, starting to bring in some of those oral skills. Then from a functional standpoint, we looked at the gut and what was going on in that gut. And do we have the right microbiome? Do we have the right gastrointestinal environment so that we can even absorb the feeding therapies and also the oral intake when he starts getting more of it? And then our dietetic and our OT team worked together to come up with those calorie recommendations and also get him on a supplementation formula that was appropriate for his age and also had a better nutritional makeup. Like I said, we work a lot with those whole food based nutrition supplements to support that. And so through all of that, we set him up for proper safety with eating, making sure he had the right environment to support him once he was ready and encouraged, engaging with food, engaging in food choices and preferences as he got a little bit older. And then our OT has really taken the lead on this one as we've built on all of those other skills and now doing introduction systematically for the different foods, the different textures, the different ways to chew. How do we get that food in? How is that influencing the gut? And so really you can see it's very seldom one individual in a silo that is influencing how your child is developing feeding or tolerance of foods or making sure we're getting enough of those things that are going to help on all the back end systems that our body needs as well. Hopefully that kind of helps give you a bigger picture of how this might all fit together. And if you're doing this all on your own, props to you. But I know that most of the time we need help and we need support or just some future guidance. So if we can do anything to help with that, as well. So with that, I will open it up one more time for questions. And then thank you.
Thank you. They were asking about your contact info. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are in Jacksonville. Our team is. We see clients virtually throughout Florida. We are happy to be part of that comprehensive team for you. If you're looking, we're happy to be a consultant if you've got a team or fill in any one of those patches where you may not have what you're looking for. I think our team on the picky eating, introducing solids, and the early feeding side is really strong and solid. We will be rolling out a program this summer, actually looking more at the nutrition related to attention and other neurodevelopmental disabilities as well. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to reach out to, there's some contact information there. You're welcome to email me as well. It's Jenny, Jenny, @alltogetherwellness.net. And I can drop that in the chat for you too.
Awesome. Thank
If that's helpful in case you have any other personal questions or anything else.
Well, well, thank you very much. I think it's great that you have a you have a group that an organization that does this because I think it's how you can just think of how many families there are that really don't have much guidance when it comes to nutrition and how to do it the best way for their loved one. So it's huge because like you said, a lot of times it is easy and it's always or I don't know. It's more convenient to do what's convenient when it comes to food. And a lot of times convenience is not healthy. So
Yeah.
it's very, very awesome that you have, like you said, or it just said in the presentation that you can, you all put together teams for families to help them in this process. So I think it's very, very cool. So I appreciate that.
Awesome. Anybody else? Oh,
I
okay.
don't think we have any more, Jennifer, but I appreciate you so, so much. Somebody said, I missed the first, or Sandy said, I missed the first slide. Is the
Yes.
presenter a PT? Oh, well, she is a doctor. Yes, Sandy. What are her credentials? Excellent presentation. We have lived this many years and wish I had this info 20 years ago. What you presented is all spot on, and we finally found a proper feeding team and functional med maps, doctor.
Awesome. I'm sorry you struggled through that, Sandy. But yeah, I'm glad you found that team. So I am a PT by background. I am functional medicine trained. So I practice functional medicine, but obviously under the scope of nutrition, lifestyle, all of those support things. And then we really try and work with your physician. So we don't have any medical doctors on our team. I find that a lot of them support what we're working on. We have a great collaboration with a lot of our physicians, but it is outside of their comfort and expertise to provide a lot of the things that we talked about today. So no, it's primarily our OT, our speech, myself as a functional medicine doctor, PT, and then we have a dietitian we consult. And then we'll work with physician of whomever you're working with. We have a couple of great physicians that are, functional medicine physicians as well that we work with. But usually it's just our team and then collaborating with your medical team wherever you are.
Well, thank you for answering that question. I
Yeah.
don't see any others. Like I said, we will send this recorded meeting will be on our YouTube page with all of our other recordings, and we'll send out information from this presentation in that email as well later on today.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great week.
You too. Bye bye.